Hello again, everyone, and welcome back to Biology 206. This is our second lecture of week 2, and we are going to be focusing on the biosphere. Okay, so our learning objectives are kind of twofold this week. The first learning objective is to understand the relationships between global patterns of precipitation and temperature that we learned about in lecture 1 of this week, and the distribution of terrestrial biomes. And then the second piece that we want to reach this week is to identify different biomes based on climate conditions and understand what that looks like in terms of the physiognomy, so the structure and type of vegetation that you have in a particular area. Okay, so those are our learning objectives this week. First, I'm going to start with this Köppen-Geiger climate classification. This is not from your text. You can find the source for it down here. But this is a world climate map, and it breaks. It's not simply based. It's a combination of. It breaks the world up into pieces based on the main climate. So there's 5 categories: equatorial, arid, warm temperate, snow, and polar. Precipitation, so desert, steppe, fully humid, summer dry, winter dry, and monsoonal. And then finally temperature, and I'm not going to read through all of those because there's lots of different temperature versions, but each location on the planet you'll see has a 3-letter combination that corresponds with. The first letter corresponds with the main climate, the second letter with the precipitation, and the third letter with the temperature. And this breaks all of these regions up based on their general climate and then their precipitation and temperature conditions. Okay, so our world climate map. Okay, so then we can compare this world climate map to a vegetation map. And this vegetation map, you can see all the different categories of vegetation that are color-coded. So for Canada, we have this boreal conifer forest and woodland, and then further south in Canada, we have this temperate boreal mixed forest. But in the areas that we are looking at, so these CS areas, if you remember, they correspond to this, the coastal regions of California, down here in Mexico, along the coast of Chile, in the Mediterranean, Australia, and down here in the southern tip of Africa and South Africa. And all of those areas correspond to xeric woodlands / scrub. And so if any of you have had the opportunity to visit a place that has a Mediterranean climate, you can just imagine these scrubby, shrub-dominated, verging on woodland type systems. They're very low. If there are trees, they're very low. Lots of shrubs, lots of plants with a very high degree of drought tolerance because they have to cope with this hot, dry summer. Okay, so if we look at any part of this, we see very close correspondence. The point is we see very close correspondence between these broad climate categories and the types of vegetation that occur there. So we know we have these tight links between climate distribution, or climatic patterns on the planet, and vegetation distribution on the planet, and there's lots of good reasons for that we will get into. Okay, so this is something that some of you will have already started thinking about if you've started your assignment, but climate diagrams in any given region provide us information that gives us clues as to the type of vegetation that we can expect to have there, given that close correspondence between vegetation and climate. So what this graph shows us is a summary of monthly mean and annual records of temperature and precipitation. So monthly values, but also if you take a look at the top, you get the average values. So average annual temperature in this particular location in Havre, Montana is 6 degrees Celsius. That's averaged across the entire year. You can see the maximum temperature, which is here in red, is somewhere around 20, maybe 22 degrees Celsius. The minimum temperature is down here around -10, -12 degrees Celsius. We also get the average precipitation. So total annual precipitation, not average. So the total annual precipitation is 287 millimeters. It's not a huge amount. It's actually a fairly low amount of precipitation. And what we see is that there's this ranges, and so in this case it's the blue line, and you have to read this second y-axis. So in these climate diagrams we have two axes. The first axis is temperature, the second axis is precipitation. The other thing that's really critical to recognize is the correspondence between temperature and precipitation. So in these climate diagrams, in order to interpret plant available water, there is a relationship between precipitation and temperature such that 1 degree temperature equals 2 millimeters of precipitation. So basically that's the balance between evapotranspirative fluxes, so evaporation and transpiration, water leaving the Earth's surface, going to the atmosphere, compared to the amount of precipitation coming in. So where precipitation is greater than evapotranspiration, we have conditions where there's a sufficient water for plant uptake and use. Where precipitation is less than that potential evapotranspiration, plants will be in water deficit. So anytime this blue precipitation line drops below the red temperature line, when they're aligned this way, where we've got 1 degree Celsius temperature equaling 2 millimeters of precipitation, then we have a water deficit. And so you can see these locations are identified in this graph. There's only one point during the year where the precipitation falls below the temperature, okay? And this is the period of the year, so during kind of between mid-July and September, there is water deficit in this system. So it's the end of summer in the northern hemisphere is dry for this particular system. But the rest of the year, there's ample precipitation. The other thing we can see from these graphs is where the red line, the temperature drops below zero. So in this case, we know that this particular system experiences freezing temperatures. So this orangey color is sub-freezing average monthly temperatures. So in the winter, temperatures drop down below zero, and so you have to, the vegetation that occurs there has to be able to deal with frost and with freezing temperatures. Not super cold freezing temperatures like we have in northern parts of Canada, but cold enough. So that the fact that the temperature line crosses freezing is a really important indicator of the types of vegetation that you may be able to have there, okay? What else do we get from this graph? That is about all we get from this graph, but what we will see as we go through the next few slides, I'm going to be showing you a climate diagram for each of the biomes that are outlined in your text. And what we can do is use these climate diagrams to characterize the types of vegetation. So this provides us the climate for a typical location in that region. And this allows us to make some inferences about the types of vegetation we would expect to see there. Okay, so this class we're going to be taking a bit of a tour through the terrestrial biomes on the planet. And so a biome is a large-scale terrestrial biologic community shaped by the regional climate, soils, and disturbance patterns where it is found, usually classified by the growth form of the dominant plants. Okay, so when we talk about biomes, we don't talk about, the animals in the biome. Instead, we talk about the type of vegetation that dominates the system. So conifer, evergreen conifers, deciduous forest, seasonally dry tropical forest, grassland. These are the types of categories that we think about when we're talking about biomes. Okay, so how do you recognize the dominant plant form? There's various ways. So first of all, this can be a floristic recognition. So, in the very simplest terms, we distinguish between, conifer or gymnosperm dominated temperate forests and deciduous or angiosperm dominated temperate forests, just as an example of a very high level of taxonomic or floristic separation of different parts of different vegetation communities. Structurally, by 3D form, and this is absolutely something we do. We talk about, grasslands, we talk about shrublands, we talk about tundra, we talk about forested systems. All of these are structural attributes. They're also linked with the types of vegetation you have there, but they really have a lot to do with what is the structure of the dominant plant form. You can have tundra that has very different types of plant communities, but a commonality of all of them is this sort of low, prostrate growth form that that occurs there because of cold temperatures, because of nutrient limitation, etc. So we have sort of convergence of the types of vegetation that can occur based on climate. Functionally, so by role, so when we think about the function of plants, this can be a really important way to distinguish the type of the contributions of those dominant taxa to to think about the functioning of the ecosystem based on the dominant plant form or some combination of these. So, in reality, it's really the latter. We think about all of these different pieces when we're evaluating what the dominant taxa is in a particular region, and these are all really important for considering it. But we can have a really important component of it is the structural and functional attributes, because we do have examples. Perhaps the most immediate one at the front of my mind is convergent evolution on these incredibly drought tolerant species that you have in desert ecosystems. So there's very different floristic groupings that occur in these areas, but they've all evolved the same types of physiological strategies to allow them to deal with those desert environments. And so although floristics can be really important in distinguishing between dominant taxa, when we're thinking about biomes, these structural and functional components are really quite important. Okay, so here we have what we're going to be doing today is a bit of a survey of the biomes, and this is a schematic or a map of the different biomes as a function of annual average temperature annual average temperature here on the x-axis, and average annual precipitation. That should be, average annual precipitation on the y-axis. So this is not the total like we saw before. This is the average. And it's really interesting to see which parts of this graph are not occupied. And so we have these lower parts of the graph occupied, where you can that you can see occupied by these different biomes. But for example, we don't see places that are incredibly cold that also have very, very high levels of annual average precipitation. So there are some combinations of climate states that just are not present on the planet. Okay, but if we take a look at this, we can see this sort of clear patterns of the scope of where you find these different types of biomes. So starting with tropical rainforest, these are places that are always warm and wet, right? It's right up at the top of this triangle. And then moving out from there, we have, cooler places that are pretty wet. These are temperate evergreen forests. You can think about temperate rainforests on the Pacific Northwest, or Acaria forest down in New Zealand. These types of very wet forests that are dominated by evergreens and have some seasonality to the annual temperature. Tropical seasonal forests are places that are nice and hot, but quite a bit drier than tropical forests, and then that grades into Savannah. So we have seasonal forest and savanna kind of combined there, but savannas are a grassland that have some trees, whereas seasonally dry forests are forests that have a a clear seasonal drought. And so they have these combined in this book. I'm going to be showing you what the climate diagrams of each of those biomes separately looks like. They kind of grade into one another and overlap, but it's important to think about what those differences look like. And then we have desert, where we have very hot conditions all the way down to really quite cold conditions. And we'll go through these different types of deserts. This would be, a subtropical desert like the Saharan desert. Whereas this would be, a continental desert like we see up here, up here in the Gobi Desert, for example. So continental desert that you have, a hot summer and a cold winter. And so you have this combination of very low precipitation, but also cold temperatures, which makes for very stressful environments. Then moving down from temperate evergreen, we have temperate deciduous forest, the type of forest that we have here in Ontario, or in the southern part of Ontario. And temperate grasslands. So again, that's determined by precipitation. Whether you have trees or whether you have grass is a function of precipitation. The same thing here in tropical seasonal forest and savanna. Your seasonal forest would be up here, your savanna would be down here, okay? And then finally we get to cold temperatures and fairly limited precipitation is boreal forest, and then grading into tundra. And we have temperate shrubland in here that has a very similar scope and climate signature as the grassland, but the grasslands tend to be a little bit wetter than the shrublands. Okay, so this is a distribution of these biomes across the planet, and again, you see really close correspondence with that and climate. Here's the equator. These are our warm, wet places, and we have these bands of tropical and tropical rainforest and tropical seasonal forest that hug that equatorial region, just as an example of that clear, the clear patterning from warm and wet to cold and dry up here, okay? Okay, so we're going to be going through the survey of our major biomes. We're going to have information on kind of the description and the location, climate features and diagrams, some information on soils. I'm going to try to knock those mushrooms off again. I'll just show you this. It's a lovely wooden set of mushrooms. The mushrooms actually come out of there. And I tried to break it the other day in our last lecture. Major biologic features, some human influences. So this ties us back into some of those human impacts that we talk about. And keep in mind that these are very broad generalizations. So even the climate diagrams that you see in your text, if you recall, something like a temperate shrubland can have a huge wide range in average annual temperature. A tropical forest can have a massive range in average annual precipitation. So what we're seeing, we're going to be looking at kind of general examples of these, but there's a lot of variation, and I'll try to highlight that where it's quite important. And there's some degree of subjectivity in interpreting all of this. And some of you will have already come across that and sort of trying to interpret the climate diagrams in the assignment that you're doing for this week. Okay, so starting off, tropical rainforest. As we just talked about, these all are located around the equator. So these are warm places, wet places. So if you recall our physical environment, these are places where those Hadley convection current, the Hadley cells are, that warm, moist air is rising up, and you form that band of clouds around the intertropical convergence zone, and a lot of precipitation falls there. So these are some of the places in the world that have the highest precipitation going. So here, this is in the Democratic Republic of Congo. It's right at the equator, so 0 degrees latitude. So smack dab on the equator. Its average annual temperature is 24.6, and its total annual precipitation is almost 2,000 millimeters of precipitation. Okay, so constant warm, constant wet. This is an aseasonal tropical forest. Okay, so it is the most benign, from a climate perspective, the most benign environment on the planet. So there's very high primary productivity because you have these warm conditions, these wet conditions, just ideal situation for plants to grow really well, which is why you end up with these tall, like these amazingly tall forests that just, anyone who's had the opportunity to be in a tropical forest, they just tower above you. The forests in these areas are really quite incredible. And the canopy is really, really important. You have a lot of stratification in canopies of tropical forest, lots of different layers of trees. And the canopy also is, is just this, has just this wealth of biologic diversity, from plants that grow on the trees to wildlife that make their homes in the canopies and are really canopy specialists. So these canopies are really a massive living entity in and of themselves. Okay, there's year-round biologic activity because there's no seasonality. So you don't have, trees dropping their leaves on a seasonal cycle. You don't have, migration of animals in response to challenging environmental conditions. It's very, very benign. Because of this climatic stability, the high levels of energy coming into the system, because it's right on the equator, and the long time, the large area of these tropical forests, as well as the very long time since a major disturbance. You think of where we live, this place was glaciated, 10,000-ish years ago, right? That is not the case in the tropics, and so there's a much longer time over which evolution has been able to play out. And so because of all these different factors, the climatic factors, the energy inputs, these large contiguous areas, and this sort of stability through evolutionary time, we have a really incredible diversity of tree species. So I work in a forest dynamics plot network where we have plots across the entire planet. The forest that has the highest diversity of tree species, so woody species, is over here on the island of Borneo, and there are 1,100 tree species per hectare. You just think about that in the context of Ontario, where we have just, a handful of tree species that occur kind of everywhere, right? So really incredible diversity, even if you're just thinking about the tree species. Lots of specialists. So because of this longer evolutionary time frame, there's lots of species that have very, very specialized resource requirements and very tight biotic interactions. So lots of examples of really important symbiosis in tropical systems. And decomposition is incredibly rapid because it's warm, because it's wet. You just have, any litter that drops onto the floor from the canopy gets turned over almost immediately by insects, by fungi, and taken back up by those plants. And so this has really important consequences for the soils in this region. So when we look at the climate diagram, there's no frost. So we see that this temperature line, it doesn't drop below, it's incredibly stable. It doesn't drop below about maybe 23 degrees Celsius. So no period where there's frost, no period where there's freezing temperatures. We have this constant, very, very constant warm temperatures, prolonged periods of wet conditions. And so in tropical rainforests, we have rainfall that's generally greater than 100 millimeters per month. And in some cases, even more than that. So here we see that there's more than 100 millimeters per month. Right, so tropical forests, warm and wet throughout the year. So soils, I mentioned this already, this really high, fast rate of decomposition. And so we have any litter, any organic material that falls, like branches, litter, etc., that fall from the canopy. Once they fall onto the floor of a tropical rainforest, they're subject to decomposition by fungi and really high turnover that's rapidly taken back up by the trees. These are really low nutrient soils. So these are very old soils, and old soils means a long time over which weathering has occurred. So we have these soils that are highly weathered. They tend to be phosphorus limited soils. Here in North America, we often think about nitrogen limitation, but these soils, with the exception of volcanic tropical areas, these soils tend to be very, very low in phosphorus, and so there's a strong reliance on mycorrhiza to access um, rock phosphates. So now, some exceptions are, of course, young volcanic soils. So in places like Hawaii, where there's active volcanic activity, that's a very different type of nutrients, nutrient availability. And river margin soils are replenished by flooding. So in these systems, we have plants that are really nutrient use efficient. So they're able to reabsorb nutrients from their tissues very well, and so there's very little loss of that to the system. Production of lignin-rich and phosphorus-poor organic matter. So the leaves are because these are evergreen tropical leaves, they tend to be fairly robust leaves, and they tend to be fairly rich in lignin. So these are kind of the structural compounds in the leaves, and they tend to be phosphorus poor because of this high nutrient sufficiency. And so you have very little returning to the soil in the way of nutrients that are really quite critical. We have the importance of fungi and these weathering processes, but in general there's a low availability of phosphorus, a heavy reliance on fungal taxa, and really what happens in these tropical systems is most of the nutrients, most of the carbon is locked up above ground. And so this is a really big concern when we have deforestation happening in these systems. So historically, the sort of major uses of tropical rainforests, there are many indigenous cultures that live in and have lived in these tropical forests for millennia. And the historical uses of these would be non-intensive hunting, gathering from the forest, and some shifting agricultural practices. There's really strong evidence of really interesting work that demonstrates strong evidence between indigenous agricultural practices and forest biodiversity, where some of the areas where soil amendment happened through sort of these shifting agricultural practices led to really rich soils and high levels of biodiversity. So really interesting legacies of indigenous land use in tropical forests that are apparent today. Current uses, though, are really quite destructive. So we have a tremendous amount of logging, mining, and really intensive agriculture. So this is just one example where I used to work in Malaysian Borneo and throughout much of Southeast Asia. There's a real push toward forest clearing for oil palm plantations. And palm oil is found in many of the processed foods that you would purchase, and it's really hard to avoid. But it leads to this kind of situation where forests are cleared in a widespread way, monoculture plantations are put into place, really intensive pesticide use that keeps basically all diversity out. And it's really hard on wildlife because these are really energy rich. The nuts, the seeds that these palms produce are really energy rich and are attractive to wildlife, and then there are conflicts between farmers and wildlife that lead to loss of biodiversity that way. So really big challenges and problems associated with that. Also when we think about so big threats to biodiversity, again, because we have such high biodiversity in these areas, if you clear a region, it's not like in a temperate zone where you have similar species across much of the region. In a tropical area, you may, by clearing an area, you may actually eliminate a species that is very localized in its distribution. And so these are really big problems when we think about tropical threats to tropical biodiversity is habitat loss and fragmentation. Threats to regional climate patterns and nutrient losses. So I have this little diagram up here. Here we have a forest, a tropical forest, where it's got all of its cycling happening, lots of water cycling happening, nutrient and water cycling happening through this system that's depicted by the blue arrows. We've got very little leaching happening because these trees, the cycling that happens in that system, as I mentioned, it's very fast. Trees take up the water and the nutrients that that comes to the surface pretty readily, and there's a tremendous amount of evapotranspiration, a tremendous amount of nutrients locked up above ground, and a tremendous amount of evapotranspiration that happens all the time from these forests. Now, when you clear that land, all of a sudden you can have a lot more water penetrating the soil. You lose most of the nutrients from the system because you've removed all of this above ground biomass. You start to have a lot more leaching because you have a lot more water moving through the soils. And so you have losses of nutrients. So we have this problem when we clear these tropical forests that it's sometimes really hard to restore them because of the losses of nutrients when you remove that biomass and the losses of nutrients due to leaching following disturbance. And big changes in terms of greenhouse gas emissions too. These forests are carbon sinks. When we remove them, the soils become carbon sources for a very long time, and this is a massive problem from our sort of global climate emergency that we are facing right now. We continue to face rapid deforestation of these tropical forests that lead to huge losses of above ground carbon and increases in emissions from the soils for long time periods. So then what happens, it depends, on the trajectory. Is it maintained in an agricultural way? Is it allowed to recover? And how long do those secondary forests take to function in a way that these primary forests did previously? Okay, another issue in the tropics increasingly is the issue of drought. So this is a picture of Panama that I took during a seasonal drought. So this is a tropical dry forest. But what we're seeing increasingly is with increasingly severe El Nino events and other components to climate change, we're seeing an increase in frequency of atypical drought in these aseasonal tropical forests that result in mortality in trees, but also increase the flammability. So often fire is used in the in land clearing during agricultural land clearing, and with the increasing drought in these tropical forests, it makes the whole system more flammable, and it leads to the potential of wildfires that we hear about that lead to a huge loss of carbon, massive risks to wildlife, additional losses of forests that above and beyond what is being removed for agricultural purposes. Okay, so moving into the tropical seasonal biome. So we're just shifting northward and southward from the equator. We're just shifting northward and southward. So this tropical seasonal biome, your book includes savannas and tropical dry forest in one category called the tropical seasonal biome, and it encompasses all of this. So this includes forests that look like this, very similar to that Panamanian forest that I just showed you a picture of. So this is a semi-evergreen forest in Ecuador. So in seasonal dry forests, some of the trees lose their leaves during the dry season. Other trees are drought tolerant and do not lose their leaves. So we've got drought avoiders and drought tolerators growing together. And then we have these kind of more savanna, this open forest with kind of woody, shrubby things and lots of grasses. These are baobab trees in Madagascar. So these types of forests. So all of these systems in this that are highlighted in red here have strong seasonality and precipitation, and that's driven by those shifts in the intertropical convergence zone. So if you recall, depending on which direction the Earth is tilting in relation to the sun, depending on where we are in the, at the spring and autumn equinox, the sun is hitting the equator most strongly, but in the winter and summer equinox, in the winter and summer solstice, I should say, the intertropical convergence zone shifts northward in the summer solstice and southward in the winter solstice because of the angle of the Earth in relation to the sun. And so that's what drives seasonality in these systems. So in these northern seasonally dry systems, they would have their wet their wet season in our summer, and these more southerly forests would have their wet season in our winter. So depending on where you are in relation to the equator, the intertropical convergence zone shifts north during part of the year, shifts south during part of the year, and spends part of the year on the equator. And that dictates the seasonality in climate for those areas. So this seasonality changes forest structure and drought deciduousness. So as you move from places that are something closer to a tropical forest to something that's closer to a desert, as you move across that gradient from the equator northward, you move through seasonally dry tropical forests that have decreasing amounts of precipitation as you move northward toward that area where the Farrell and the Hadley cells converge and come back down, which drives the desert patterns. And then as precipitation decreases further, trees become less common. You end up with scrubbier vegetation, shrubs, grasses, and trees are harder to support as precipitation becomes less and less. Okay, so drives changes in forest structure, composition, etc. And the demarcation between dry forests and savanna is driven by both climate conditions and disturbance processes. So when we think about savanna systems, these systems have the fire and grazing by large herbivores both play a really important role, in addition to low precipitation, in maintaining a very open woodland type system. Okay, so because you have things like elephants and giraffes and all of these different large herbivores coming through and really like chomping down vegetation, as well as regular fires that burn through and kill the woody vegetation, that helps to maintain this kind of more open woodland structure of savannas. Okay, but I just did want to highlight the differences between these two parts of this seasonally dry biome. So tropical dry forests have marked patterns, seasonality and precipitation, but not in temperature. So very similar to tropical forests, they have this constant hot climate. So 25, this has an average temperature of 27 degrees, 27, almost 30 degrees. And they have they have similar amounts of precipitation as tropical forests, but it's seasonal because of that intertropical convergence zone issue that we just discussed. So in all of these places, these are all, note the difference in where these months are. I wish they hadn't done that on this figure. But these two seasonally dry forests in the northern hemisphere, you can see that they have their wet period, so almost monsoonal type rainfall. They get almost all of their rainfall, like 1,400, 1,800 millimeters. Most of that falls within this summertime window, this northern summer window from May to about October. In contrast, this seasonally dry forest in Australia has its wet period where it gets about 1,500 millimeters of rain during our winters, so during the southern summer. So we just talked about that intertropical convergence, so these climate diagrams demonstrate that really nicely. Okay, so marked seasonal contrast in lushness of the vegetation. So there you see a really strongly drought deciduous tropical forest, where most of the species in that forest lose their leaves. And then those leaves flush again when the rains come back. We have migrations of fauna in response to this. So this is kind of like our winter, right? A lot of animals move out of Canada during the winter because it's not a productive place, not a good place to live during that time. The same thing happens in these tropical dry forests. Animals migrate to other regions where they can meet their resource requirements better. So tropical dry forests, some pressures facing these tropical dry forests. There are incredibly high population densities in these regions. And when we have high population densities, there's simply more pressure on these landscapes. And so we can see here are types of tropical forests, so rainforest, wet forest, moist, dry, and very dry tropical forests. And we see that the number of people per kilometer squared is the highest in these moist and dry, so these seasonal tropical forests. So there's lots of different activities that happen in these areas. So forestry, ranching, different types of farming, all of this puts pressure on the forest systems, just like it does in North America with all of our various intensive land uses. When you have a lot of people in an area and a lot of resource, a lot of different land intensive activities, you end up with more pressure on the ecosystems that the people live around. Okay, tropical savanna. So very similar climate diagrams. So again, very hot conditions, 28 degrees, almost 29 degrees. A little bit more seasonal here in Australia, you can see in the temperature. So the temperatures of these savanna systems are a little bit more variable than we saw in those tropical dry forests. But we see the same pattern of like all of the precipitation falling in a certain time frame. And so again, these two sites, these two savanna areas, and so you can see that compared to the previous slide, here's our tropical dry forests. Our savannas are those ones that are just south of the Tropic of Cancer and just north of the Tropic of Capricorn, just before you transition to desert. Okay, and so again, in the northern hemisphere, we get all of this precipitation happening in our summer months when that intertropical convergence zone has shifted northward. And in the south, down here in Australia, we have all the precipitation happening during the southern summer or the northern winter. And I think it's really notable here how variable these patterns are. They lead to the same type of forest, but you can see that these two, so this savanna system is much further south from the Tropic of Cancer compared to the location of this savanna ecosystem in Niger or this savanna ecosystem in Australia, which is really close to the Tropic of Capricorn. You can see how much less precipitation these two systems get. They're tropical savannas, really almost bordering on deserts. Well, they truly are bordering on deserts. So 386, 417 millimeters of rainfall. Most months do not have enough precipitation to meet evapotranspirative demands of the plants. Transpirative demands of the plants. Whereas over here in this site in Venezuela, there's a lot of precipitation over a long time period. So this would be a much lusher type of savanna compared to these two. So just highlighting the variability in what these climate diagrams can look like. Okay, so we tend to have kind of a feast or famine kind of situation. So again, there's really strong migratory patterns of animals within savanna ecosystems, but they tend to be, so they respond to the rainy season and they respond to elevational gradients as well to kind of move around the landscape to find the resources that they need. And this open grassland system with some trees is really it's maintained by fire and grazing, as we've already talked about. Now finally, we tend to have, because of fire, grazing, low precipitation, these systems tend to be dominated by grasslands, thorny and scrubby scattered trees, so lots of protections in the woody vegetation that does manage to establish is really heavily protected from herbivores. They have large spines. I don't know if you've heard about the acacia trees whose spines are actually inhabited by ants, which will then go and attack herbivores that are trying to consume them. So there's all kinds of evolutionary strategies that have been developed through evolutionary time to help some of these woody species be able to maintain themselves in this really challenging system. Okay, so again, we have a wet season that's short and intense. The total precipitation is lower than that for forests typically. In that Venezuelan example, that was not the case, but the soils are really important because they have this lateritic zone in the soil that's pretty close to the surface that's impermeable. So you have this accumulation of this hard layer, this accumulation of minerals at not too deep into the soil that prevents water from moving too deep, and so this can help maintain soil moisture for longer time periods instead of just having gravimetric drainage happening. Yeah, and we've already talked about this last point. So in terms of pressures, this is, fairly similar to the tropical dry forests, and so, shared challenges, fairly high population densities in these regions. And there's lots, because of these high population densities, we have a lot of conversion of savanna to agricultural land that then draws more people in. There's a lot of socioeconomic issues that underlie some of these sort of patterns of movement of people on the landscape to places where they can maintain a living through agricultural practices. So we have expansion of human populations near protected areas that leads to more conversion of savanna ecosystems to agricultural areas. And so we have these pressures that are greatest at the park boundaries. And so there's a lot of work being done in these regions to try to protect these areas by working with local communities to help to value to add value to preserving these ecosystems, these savanna ecosystems, through, for example, ecotourism activities. And there's challenges in that as well, no question about that. But there are all sorts of ways that communities are becoming more and more engaged in the protection of some of these really quite amazing savanna systems. Okay. So where we do have agricultural, though, there's all kinds of challenges because of plowing. So we plow soils when we grow food, and this can disrupt that soil layer. You remember that lateritic soil layer and that helped to maintain moisture. So that can disrupt that soil structure, leading to droutier conditions in the soil. It can also, as you disrupt that soil, because of the nature of the soil, it can also lead to erosion. We've got these very high precipitation amounts during certain parts of the year. If you do not have vegetation on those soils, it leads to a tremendous amount of erosion. We have a lot of livestock ranching that happens in these areas, and so you have this conflict between native wildlife and these domesticated herds. And so what we're seeing, and I guess the other component of that is the nature of the pressure that these domestic herds that are typically at much higher densities than native wildlife would be. There's a lot more pressure on the vegetation where they are grazing, and this can lead to this can further promote erosion in these systems. And so this climate change coupled with increased population densities, both in terms of human populations and wild livestock densities, so domesticated animals, is leading to desertification in different places. So expansion of the Sahel into these savanna ecosystems. So all kinds of challenges that are being faced in these regions, and we see these kinds of problems have happened in North America as well, in the wheat belt, where you've got again a grassland dominated system where deep rooting plants help to support soil maintenance. Once you start to use this for agriculture, it leads to this sort of increasing erosion and desertification problem. Okay, so then moving even further north and south to those places where the Ferrell and the Hadley cells converge with their dry air. These are places where we find subtropical deserts, so near 30 degrees north or south. So we've got our our convective cells here, and these regions are where we have our subtropical deserts, descending air and high pressure zones. Okay, so we talked about that in our last lecture. We talked about both of these things as well, though. Rain shadow deserts, so those deserts that are caused by moist air moving up and over mountains, dropping its precipitation on the windward side of the mountain, and then coming down and creating these rain shadow deserts in the leeward side of the mountain. And finally, continental deserts like the Gobi Desert, where you have winds that are moving across the continent, and so they're very dry winds. There's not big bodies of water for them to pick up moisture and redistribute it, and so you have these large expanses of very dry continental regions that lead to large deserts. We also have coastal deserts, which are driven by a combination of wind conditions and rain shadow effects, and we'll talk about one example there. But overall, about 20% of the land surface on Earth is deserts. So pretty unproductive systems, but really interesting ecosystems. Okay, so common features of deserts: low precipitation. So this is an example of a climate diagram for a desert. So seasonality and temperature. So this is in Algeria. Very high temperatures, but seasonality in this. So we have these winter months where the temperatures are a bit cooler, around 10, 12 degrees, and they get up to over 30 degrees, 35 degrees or so. And the average temperature is 22, but seasonality in that. Total annual precipitation is 39 millimeters. That's, we sometimes get that in a single precipitation event here. So you can see very low precipitation year round. Some deserts, and you do see this little period here where you get almost all the precipitation for the year. Those little windows of precipitation are very, very important in many deserts. Those are times where opportunistic species will use that moisture and complete their entire life cycle in a very short time period. So you have these amazing periods in deserts where everything flushes and blooms in response to these short windows of precipitation, and then everything sort of goes dormant again. So really, truly, the demonstrating the importance of drought avoiders in these systems. Okay, bottom line is there is a lack of available water during much of the year, and so the types of vegetation that you can have in these systems are very limited. You either have drought tolerators, so these types of succulent plants that have alternate forms of physiology that allow them to avoid water loss, minimize or avoid water loss, or drought avoiders, so these opportunistic species that will complete their life cycles in those very short time frames. Okay, soils are often poor, very little organic matter, because if you don't have plants, you don't have a lot of organic matter entering the soil, and high concentrations of salts because of the rapid evaporation of water from the surface. Salts tend to accumulate in these areas. Okay. But I did want to show you that there's a lot of variability in the climate diagrams of deserts. And so here's a desert from Arizona. Arizona, Yuma, Arizona. There's one from Chad, Faya Largo, and there's one from the Mongolian, this continental desert, Zaman Uded. I'm sure I said that wrong. And you can see that these are all very, very different in their climate diagrams. We have very big differences in the mean annual precipitation. So 86 millimeters compared to 15. So this desert in Chad is incredibly dry. 124 millimeters here in Mongolia. So relatively, water rich compared to those other systems. Big differences in temperatures too. So both of these are pretty warm year round. The desert in Chad is much hotter, almost 30 degrees annual average temperature. This Mongolian desert is an average annual temperature of 3.6 degrees Celsius. So this really demonstrates this continental desert pattern. We'll get into those continental deserts, but continental deserts have these periods of cold, so where temperature drops below freezing. So you have to have anything that lives there has to be tolerant of both incredibly dry conditions, so almost no precipitation here, but also incredibly, but also be able to tolerate frost and freezing temperatures. And you can see differences in kind of the amount of precipitation and where it falls. And so, presumably here in Chad, all of the activity would happen right around this August, this bit of precipitation that happens in August, because the rest of the year there is none. Okay, so subtropical deserts, this is where they're located, right where those Hadley and Ferrel cells converge at the tropics of Cancer and Capricorn. So 30 degrees north and south, roughly. High atmospheric pressure zones, because you have those converging convection cells. Precipitation is low, less than 25 centimeters per year, mostly in the summer months. Whether, depending on where you are, whether it's the southern or the northern summer. There's a lot of drought tolerance, so, different succulent plants that, in this case, these cacti have, the spines are actually modified leaves, so they really have very little in the way of transpirational surface area. Their photosynthetic tissue is in their stems. They use alternate types of physiology. Most desert plants either use, very common is to use CAM photosynthesis, where they actually open their stomates at night. They store carbon dioxide in their tissues and they open their stomates at night to really minimize water loss, or C4 photosynthesis, which concentrates carbon dioxide around the point of CO2 uptake, which is rubisco. So both of those are ways that we see water loss minimized, but these are two totally different taxonomic families is the point, and these have evolved in different places. So you have cactus here, you have euphorbs here. These are CAM photosynthetic pathways, C4 photosynthetic pathways. Structurally very similar plants. They've evolved the same types of morphology because of the conditions that they're living in. We also have these opportunists that I talked about, where you have plants that really take advantage of that short period of moisture to complete their entire life cycle. So they go from seed to seed in a 2-week period in some cases. So examples here are the Australian deserts, the African deserts, the Saharan and Sahel deserts. Okay. Next up is continental deserts. We just talked about these. These are the two main ones are the Gobi Desert and the Great Basin Desert of the USA, which is also affected by a rain shadow. So it's kind of a combination of a continental desert and a rain shadow desert. But they have continental climates. So if you recall the continental climates, cold winters, hot summers. And so we see that real seasonality and temperature in these continental deserts. Cold winters, very little precipitation. And you have to have both drought tolerance and frost tolerance in place in these plants. And happily for plants, there's sort of shared mechanisms that support both of those. And wildlife is really sparse. These are really harsh environments that do not support a lot of wildlife. Okay, and just as a reminder, that's what that's what the climate signature of a continental desert looks like for Mongolia and the Gobi Desert. Okay, rain shadow deserts, we talked about these already, so I'm going to really quickly go through this, but you have that warm, moist air coming off of the ocean. Let's pretend this is the Pacific Northwest, so this is the Pacific Ocean. You got the westerlies blowing up and over the mountain, dropping all that precipitation onto that windward side of the mountain, and then it comes back down, and as that, there's very little moisture left in the air, and increasingly less so as the air expands, as it warms up. So you end up with these areas that get very little precipitation because of this rain shadow effect. And the lack of moisture can be incredibly extreme. So there are parts of the Judean desert that get less than 100 millimeters of rain in a year. So that's really very dry conditions. Then we have coastal deserts. These are not restricted to any latitude. It depends on patterns of precipitation. In the Atacama Desert in Chile, climate and rain shadow are really important. So it's up here in this map. So basically, precipitation is blocked because of mountains to the east. So you have no precipitation that comes from from this direction. So the winds are moving in this direction. This is in the southern hemisphere. The winds are moving in this direction, and there's mountains here. So you have a rain shadow effect that impacts this part of Chile, and then you have a prevailing high pressure zone over the Pacific Ocean out here. That means that there's no precipitation happening because of maritime influence. And so there are some locations in this desert that have no recorded precipitation. So absolutely no rainfall during the year. So that's a a very extreme type of desert. Okay, so human influences in deserts. Irrigation is a big issue. People have inhabited these desert environments and really have made an effort to build them up and make them green and lush, despite the fact that they are not green, lush places. So you can think of Las Vegas. Here is a hotel in Las Vegas in the middle of a desert, and yet they have this big water feature in front of it. So they're pumping water up from aquifers and using water in ways that are probably that are really quite unsustainable. Irrigation. Here is a sorry, I'm just going to remind myself here, an irrigated rice field near Yuma. So we just saw the climate signature of Yuma, Arizona, the Yuma Desert. This is an irrigated rice field in that area. So you have water sitting on top of desert soils trying to grow rice. You can see the mountains that are causing some of that rain shadow right over there. So because of irrigation, we end up with salt buildup. Again, if you have a lot of water sitting on the soils in these very, very hot environments where evaporation is very fast, the water goes and the salts that are in the water, the solutes in the water are left behind, and so you end up with salinity, with salt buildup in soils in these regions. Water overexploitation. We have massive, massive issues throughout these desert regions. And you think about the United States, where in these very hot, dry parts of the United States, where they have completely depleted the aquifers in these areas, and rivers are running dry because of water extraction from those rivers. And so this leads to all of these things: water overexploitation, and combined with climate change can lead to greater risks of desertification. And that's in combination too with, pressures in the adjacent ecosystems. So when we think about Africa, those sub-Saharan regions where savannas are being, used for agricultural purposes, very intensive agricultural purposes in some cases, this can lead to, that combined with some of these processes in deserts lead to further desertification or expansion of deserts. Okay, temperate shrublands and woodlands. So when we're talking about these are some of the systems that we already looked at in that CSA diagram. So Mediterranean ecosystems, for example. There's a number of different names for them: chaparral, madrel, garrigue, fynbos. So fynbos is used in South Africa, chaparral in the United States. Mallee, I'm not familiar with all of these names, but these are all different sort of local names for these sort of scrubby, temperate shrublands and woodlands. And so they look like this: very, very open systems, lots of low vegetation. So we have all sorts of different places around the world that have these ecosystems, but they're, again, they correspond with that CSA, CSB type ecosystem that we saw in the Köppen-Geiger climate diagram. So you have scattered evergreen woody shrubs, lots of grasses, very aromatic herbs. Many of the plants in these systems have a lot of, are very aromatic, and this actually makes them, which many of those aromatic substances are chemicals produced to defend the plants for various reasons from different herbivores, particularly from different herbivores, but they tend to be very flammable components as well. Lots of fire-resistant plants. So because fire is such an important component of this system, you tend to have many species that have various mechanisms of either fire tolerance, so lots of resprouting, or fire resistance, so really thick bark that protects the cambium when fire passes through. And these are really diverse places. In South Africa, the Fynbos in South Africa, in the Cape region, the Cape Floristic region, is one of the most diverse places on the planet. It's one of the biodiversity hotspots that's been identified. So these places, they have both incredible diversity and incredible endemism because of the unique climate in these areas. There has been the evolution of a large number of taxa that only occur in those places. And so the endemism in some of these areas is incredibly high. Okay, so climate diagram. What we see here is precipitation that exceeds evapotranspiration. So our blue line is above our red line for much of the year, but there are periods of the year where there's insufficient precipitation for plant growth. And as we saw from the CSA diagram, we tend to have hot, dry summers and somewhat wetter, cooler winters. And that's kind of the climatic signature of those areas. So temperatures are warm and hottest in the summer. Summers are dry, winter is the rainy season, and we end up with these kind of woody shrubland and grassland systems that you see depicted in this image. Okay, so some of these points I've already made, but I guess the additional points I want to highlight here, first of all, again, is the variability in these Mediterranean climates. So again, depending on where you are, you can see a very, very different pattern of precipitation and temperature, both in terms of total precipitation. So here we have 259 millimeters as high as 538. And the period where your precipitation is insufficient to meet evapotranspirative demands varies from one region to the next. And again, note that here in Adelaide, Australia, we've got the reverse. So we've got the warm, wet season in, the hot, dry season in our winter in the southern summer. And the opposite is true here in these two northern hemisphere Mediterranean sites. But these are really quite different in terms of both their temperature signatures and their precipitation signatures. And so again, just highlighting this variability. Many plants have defenses against fire and browsing, lots of water conservation strategies. So again, some of those physiological mechanisms we talked about, but also various responses to conserve water, including losing leaf area during dry time periods, among other things. Okay, so soils are often fragile, moderate fertility. So disturbance in these areas can really have a substantial impact on the soils. All right, in terms of human influences, there are high population densities in these areas, but typically the uses in these systems tend to be low intensity agriculture. So this results in a sort of a more sustainable type of agricultural system. Again, because of the fragile soils in these areas, intensive agriculture could really lead to substantial damage in these places. But because of this lower intensity, it's not as much of an issue. Urbanization. So these Mediterranean areas are places where people like to live. They're wonderful climates. And there's a lot of people in these areas. And so urbanization and loss of habitat because of conversion of these Mediterranean shrublands and woodlands to urban areas is a real threat to this system. And climate change. So these hot, dry summers lead to a lot of flammability, and you've probably seen in the news repeatedly for the past few years these really intense and out of control fires that we've been seeing in many parts of the Mediterranean in Europe, as well as many regions of Chaparral and California, for example. And so we see that as the climate warms and dries, these places become more flammable and fires become more challenging to manage. And also because of this urbanization, we have a lot more interface between people and fires in these landscapes. Okay, temperate grasslands. So these also have lots of different names: prairies, steppes, veldt, pampas. Depending on where you are in the world, that people call these grasslands different things, but they're natural grasslands. And these are some of the most threatened ecosystems on the planet. These are places that whenever people have moved into a new area, when people have expanded around the planet, and settled new regions, regions that are new to them, I should say. These are the places that they have converted to agriculture most readily. And of course, that makes sense. They're rich soils. You do not have to clear forest to use these areas for agriculture. And so they're really a natural place to want to establish farms. So in these areas, because of, there's sufficient precipitation to keep a fairly lush grassland, but there's insufficient precipitation to support the production, the growth of trees and shrubs. So there's not woody vegetation. And this is in part, again, like the savannas, it's in part dictated by the precipitation. It's in part dictated by the fire and the role of fire and grazing in these areas. And so regular fire burns through and destroys or naturally would have burned through and destroys the woody vegetation that's recruiting into the system, and large herbivores that graze the areas also keep that woody vegetation down. And so these areas tend to be big, expansive grasslands free of woody vegetation. So lots of large vertebrate herbivores and lots of invertebrate herbivores. So there's lots of invertebrate taxa that are supported by these native assemblages of plants. Okay, so temperate grassland, what does this look like? Again, pretty warm conditions. So we have, average temperatures of 9.1 degrees Celsius, but we do have this period of freezing where we get below zero during the winter. Precipitation is enough to meet evapotranspirative demands year round. So there's not a shortage of precipitation. But precipitation is also not exceptionally high. So here we have this is a grassland in Nebraska, and the precipitation is 727 millimeters. So most precipitation occurs in the growing season. So you see seasonality in precipitation, where we have the most precipitation here in the growing season. Cool to cold and dry winters, so depending on where you are. So if you're in Saskatchewan, the winters are very, very cold and dry. If you're further south, they're going to be warmer. Subject to droughts, and this is part of what limits woody vegetation. So subject to droughts, sometimes these droughts can be very prolonged. So even though your average precipitation may be reasonable and could support woody vegetation, these prolonged droughts can limit that. There's very deep soils, deep rich soils with a lot of organic matter and very slow decomposition. And so these grasslands, the species that are native to these grasslands tend to have incredibly deep rooting systems. They can access very deep sources of soil moisture, but also they're really that leads to a lot of organic material being deposited in deep layers of soil. But also it protects the soil from erosional processes. And this has been a problem with agricultural development in these areas because a lot of the crop species tend to have very superficial roots that do not hold the soils in place compared to the native grass species that would have occurred there in the past. And so we've ended up with desertification in some of these areas because of that. And so you can see this beautiful dark horizon. So organic layer at the surface with these nice deep roots, and then these dark rich soil horizons here. The A horizon being very deep and rich. Okay, so major human influences or conversion to agriculture. There have been some really successful restoration efforts, but these tend to be very intensive, time intensive, people intensive, and small scale. So whether or not that's a sustainable effort is unclear. We've seen a lot of loss of soil, and so this is you might have heard of the Dust Bowl, and this was a time where really intensive agricultural practices, overgrazing in the Midwest in the United States, led to really a desertification of that area, and that has been restored to some degree. But when like those savanna ecosystems, when agriculture is too intense in these grasslands, it leads to massive loss of soil, and then a system that is not hospitable for plant growth. Okay, moving through to temperate forests. And so we're going to be looking at two different types of temperate forests. These are both pictures of temperate rainforests, which we have in South America, along the Pacific Northwest, down here in Florida. So we have seasonal deciduous forests in Eurasia and North America, and then temperate coniferous rainforests in New Zealand, southern Chile, Pacific Northwest of North America. Okay, so we're going to break those apart. We have temperate seasonal deciduous forests. So these are the types of forests we have in this region, of course. Lots of vertical stratification, so you have all kinds of sort of a shade-tolerant understory or the subcanopy, the sapling bank, juveniles that are recruiting. If you walk through a maple forest, you can see all those little tiny maples that are about this size, and they take advantage of, they leaf out earlier than the adults in the canopy. They take advantage of that short window of light in the spring, and they capture all their carbon during that time and then kind of sit for the rest of the summer while the canopy shades them out. So we have a lot of vertical stratification, lots of species that form sort of treelets or short trees in the canopy profile, and then the taller canopy dominance. And then lots of herbaceous plants. And so again, if you go into these forests in the spring before the trees leaf out, you'll see all kinds of amazing things flowering, these spring ephemerals that, again, like the saplings in the understory, really take advantage of that highlight window where the snow's gone, it's warm enough to grow, but the canopy has not fully expanded yet, and they can capture almost all of their carbon during those time windows. And these are right, so here's the climate diagram for temperate deciduous forests. These are the areas that you find it in: Eurasia, Western Europe, over here in Asia, and North America. So seasonal temperatures. So we do have a cold winter time, warm summer. Seasonal precipitation, where we have the most precipitation happening in the summer growing season months, and pretty substantial, a fairly high level of precipitation. So in this particular spot in Pennsylvania, we have about 850 millimeters of precipitation. So seasonality and temperature, long growing season, plus a winter, precipitation exceeds evapotranspiration, so greater than 600 millimeters per year. And we have trees rather than grasses. So this is comparing it to the temperate grassland system. This system does not tend to experience the types of drought that we saw in those temperate grasslands, and fire is really infrequent. And there are certainly grazing herbivores, but not to the extent that we see in those grassland systems, not playing the same kind of role. Okay, so frost can occur very early and late in the season as well. So we can have these sort of very early season frosts, late season frosts that can have a pretty important impact on tree growth. All right, so these are these spring ephemerals I was talking about here. We have some lovely trout lilies, some trilliums, some spring beauties. So we have all of these different species that all bloom at one time before that canopy, before the leaves in the canopy emerge, and these plants complete most of their annual life cycle during this time, and then they just kind of sit in the understory. Some of them even die back completely, and just the bulb is stored for the rest of the summer. So they're all of their physiological activity happens in that highlight period, that moist highlight period during the spring. So moist growing season. We also have more moisture in the winter than in grassland. So we tend to have a lot more snow accumulation in these areas in the wintertime, or rain depending on your latitude. Cold but snowy winters, and generally very fertile soils. So pretty rich. These temperate forest areas are incredibly rich areas, and here in Canada, some of our richest temperate regions are now totally paved over. So urbanization has played a real role in reducing the extent of some of the most productive temperate forests on the planet. So temperate evergreen forests, these are those temperate rainforests that have the biggest trees on the planet. So really high precipitation, but a more moderated temperature than tropical forests, for example. So mild winters, heavy winter rain, summer fog, and moderate summer drought. So we see over here our precipitation. In this particular site in Australia, this is about 700 millimeters of precipitation per year, and an average annual temperature. So again, this is reversed. Here we have June, July, August. So the cool and drier period in this area in Australia is during the northern summer, the northern summer, which is the southern winter. But you can see higher precipitation than evapotranspiration year round. But these other components, so heavy winter rain, summer fog, and moderate summertime drought. These systems are dominated by natal leaf trees, so evergreens, conifer evergreens, so redwoods, firs, or acacia, so the monkey puzzle trees here in Argentina. And really low diversity, so they're high biomass systems, but low diversity, and the fossil evidence of these forests goes right back to the mid Mesozoic. So these are old, so gymnosperm taxa that are very old evolutionarily. And this is what some of these systems look like on the Pacific Northwest. Big towering cathedrals of trees. Okay, so temperate forests, the human influences, this is the human influences for many of these areas. These are places that were settled very intensively. Agriculture initially established, and then as those population centers grew, urbanization really gobbled up a lot of those lands, and then agriculture continues to expand, and those urban centers continue to expand. We hear about all of this urban sprawl issues. Exploitation of forests, so forest harvesting is a big issue in temperate forests, or has been for a very long time. So various industrial uses of those forests. There are certainly efforts to reforest many areas, but again, because of the expansion of population centers in these temperate regions, lots of roads and throughout these regions, habitat fragmentation and loss is a really major player in temperate forests worldwide. Okay, so we are down to our second last biome, and this is the taiga, or the boreal biome. And it is a band of forest that encircles the northern hemisphere. It is the largest intact forested biome on the planet, and it's a very really highly kind of it's a very low diversity system, with the same species repeating themselves across much of North America, and the same genera being duplicated between North American boreal and the Eurasian boreal. Okay, so this part of this biome is characterized by long winters, short growing seasons. So we can see this here. Our temperatures that only get up above zero between April and May and drop down at below zero again in September or October. So a very short growing season, low maximum temperatures typically, and very cold winters. So a high degree of variability in climate between seasons. So we go from minus 30 here in the winter to plus 20 in the summer. So at least a 50-degree variation in temperature at this particular location, which happens to be Fort Simpson in the Northwest Territories, a site that I work at quite extensively, or a community that I work near quite extensively. Okay, so long winter, short growing season, low mean annual temperature, and really extreme ranges as we already discussed. Moderate annual rates of precipitation, so not a huge amount. So 333 millimeters is the total annual precipitation, average total annual precipitation there, with maybe a bit more coming in the summer compared to the winter. But in most of these, in many boreal forests, you know, about half of the precipitation comes as snow in the winter, and that snow-covered period really dominates the year. Okay, so thin acidic soils and low fertility. So these forests tend to actually accumulate these thick organic soil layers on top of various types of glacial deposits. So they tend to be very acidic soils, really low fertility, particularly low nitrogen, and so yeah, a fairly, in general, a low productivity system. Okay, so the types of human influences in the taiga or the boreal biome. One is forest exploitation. We see a lot of forest exploitation happening in the southern parts of in the southern parts of the boreal, particularly in the southern parts of the boreal in Ontario and Quebec and Alberta. But a really major human influence in the boreal, probably the largest human influence in the boreal, is climate change. And so we're seeing a number of aspects of climate change that are having a big impact on boreal ecosystems. So high latitude ecosystems, high northern latitudes are warming 3 to 4 times faster than the rest of the planet. And this is leading to all kinds of changes. So these areas are warming. I have drying here. This doesn't necessarily mean that precipitation is decreasing, but that the increase where precipitation is increasing, it's not increasing at a rate that allows, that keeps pace with warming. And so if we warm faster than precipitation increases, then we start to have water deficits because of that additional evapotranspirative loss. Okay, so we have overall drying of this system. Climate change is also leading to more lightning in boreal ecosystems, and a combination of a drier landscape plus more lightning leads to more ignitions. And so we're seeing a real increase in the annual area burned, as well as the frequency and severity of boreal wildfires. And we see that in the news pretty much every summer. Some part of boreal North America or boreal Eurasia is experiencing sort of record-breaking fire seasons. Changes in insect pests that are associated with climate change. So we were all too familiar with the mountain pine beetle outbreak, but that had to do with an endemic species whose range expanded with climate warming. So as those really killing winter temperatures were lost with climate warming, the range of this species could expand, and now it's moving its way across pine-dominated forests in North America. So these kinds of changes in insect pest distribution, or the ability of insect pests to overwinter, is altering insect pest dynamics in boreal systems, and we expect that to increase with ongoing warming. And then finally, permafrost thaw. And here I have a map of the distribution of different types of permafrost. It's also overlaying on that is surface soil organic carbon content in peats. So again, these boreal systems are really characterized by thick peat soils. But what we see is that a huge amount of the boreal biome, so this is the northern tree line, a huge amount of the boreal biome is underlain by, in Canada or in North America, is underlain by permafrost. And globally, about 80% of the boreal is underlain by permafrost. So changes in this foundation, this frozen soil foundation. So permafrost is soil that's at or below 0 degrees for 2 or more consecutive years. And this varies in its extent from sort of isolated patches right up to continuous permafrost that's under everywhere you walk has permafrost underlying it. And changes in this physical foundation of the boreal biome can have big implications for changes in land cover, for really rapid disturbances where we have abrupt thaw processes happen, for changes in the hydrology of the system that lead to drought impacts. And so changing permafrost conditions are a really important component of boreal systems. And the other piece to that, of course, links in with this soil carbon. The more you thaw out these landscapes, the more carbon is available to be released to the atmosphere. And so there's a lot of concern about the ability of the boreal biome to continue as a real carbon sink, which it has for a very long time, because we're accelerating wildfire, we're accelerating insect pest disturbance, we're thawing out these frozen soils. All of these things lead to greater loss of carbon from the system. So lots of questions about what that function of the boreal biome will be moving forward. This is one example of what permafrost thaw can look like in the landscape. This is from that site near Fort Simpson that I work at. So you can see anywhere where there's trees, there's permafrost, and this wet open area here is permafrost free, and it's really kind of neat. You can walk along with a frost probe, which is just a metal pole poking it into the soil. You can feel ice in the soil, and then you get to the edge here and you bury yourself in the peat. The peat is very deep at this site. What happens as this thawing edge progresses into this permafrost plateau is that the trees, the physical foundation that the trees are growing on is destabilized. The trees topple into these wetlands. They're referred to as drunken forests or drunken trees. And we lose that forest, and it doesn't come back because this particular location in the landscape, so the southern parts of permafrost are what we consider to be ecosystem protected permafrost. The climate is now too warm for that permafrost to recover. So this is what a thawing forest can look like. In terms of wildfires, I'm just going to highlight one wildfire event that was, really impactful to me and in my research, but also, of course, to the Northwest Territories. But we see these kinds of large fire years happening year after year in different parts of Canada, Alaska, Siberia, and in 2014, a huge area burned in the Northwest Territories. You can see all of these little fire cartoons on the map. Those were all active fires happening at one time. There was so much smoke produced from these fires that it extended all the way down through Alberta and into the Dakotas. So a huge amount of smoke transport from these fires to other parts of North America. So I was living up in the Northwest Territories with my family that summer. The city we were living in, Yellowknife, was cut off from the rest of Canada for, typically for a couple of weeks at a time because of road closures with fires moving across roads. The air quality was really terrible. We were not able to go outside many days, but, once the fires started to die down and I was able to get out onto the landscape as an ecologist, I recognized the real need to get out there and sort of start to ask some questions about the impacts of these fires. So what we've observed in the aftermath of these 2014 wildfires in the Northwest Territories is massive carbon losses. So massive losses both during the fire and following the fire because of sort of smoldering of peat soils. So losses of legacy carbon, old carbon that's older than the stand. We've seen loss of ecological resilience, so transitions of one forest type to another in response to these severe wildfires. And the potential for long-term impacts on wildlife habitat availability, that should read wildlife habitat availability. So these wildfires impact the nature of the habitat, the forest that recovers following fire, which can have which has implications for which wildlife can use those parts of the boreal. And then, of course, for many parts of boreal North America, this wildland-urban interface is really, really important. We see huge impacts on human populations that are living at this interface in terms of, losses of communities and fires actually burning into communities. Okay, and our last biome is the tundra. So this is up here, in the Arctic parts of the northern hemisphere. And tundra ecosystems, they have long, cold winters, so even longer and colder than the boreal. There's continuous permafrost with, a thaw depth of half a meter to a meter. So again, if you stick that metal pole in the ground, you will hit a frozen layer at 50 centimeters or maybe a meter if you're in a fairly wet area or an area that accumulates a lot of snow. They're poorly drained soils in part because of this. When you only have 50 centimeters or a meter of thawed soil, any precipitation that comes in sort of doesn't have any place to go necessarily. You don't necessarily have it draining off the landscape, and because there's very little in the way of vegetation, there's not a lot of transpiration that happens. So we have little in the way of transpirative fluxes to the atmosphere, and because of the cool climate, the evaporative fluxes are fairly low. So you have sort of thin. The thawed soils are thin. The drainage ends up, or the soils end up being fairly wet because of how little water is moving up to the atmosphere from these systems. Soils tend to be fairly nutrient poor. This, like in the boreal, this has a lot to do with, the fact that you've got these cold, wet soils. There's very little in the way of microbial activity. And there's a lot of competition for the limited resources that are there. Typically low or dwarf vegetation, so you can see this here in this, a fairly high Arctic type site. You definitely have tundra. Some of the tundra sites that I've worked in have taller shrubby plants growing in them. So there's variation in the sort of structure of the vegetation that grows there. And one of the changes we're seeing in tundra ecosystems is an expansion of that taller, upright, woody vegetation on these landscapes, which has huge implications for any number of things, including kind of how much, the atmospheric fluxes of water and carbon, and also the albedo of those surfaces. Lots of migratory taxa. So both the boreal and the tundra are home to many, many migratory species who come to the north to breed during the summer and then fly south again to avoid the harsh winters that the tundra and the boreal biomes are characterized by. And then really, big importance of population cycles. So these tundra environments are where we see really strong, are one of the places where we see really strong connections between predator and prey species. And so these, lynx and snowshoe hare relationships, for example, that you learn as sort of a classic example of population cycles. And I'm sure we'll learn about similar things as we move into the population unit of this course. The climate diagram, here we go. So pretty cool temperatures. So we get up to sort of an average maximum in July of about 10 degrees. I've certainly been on the tundra when it's much, much warmer than that, but also when there's snow on the tundra in July. So your average temperature is around 10 degrees. You have this very, very short growing season. See, there's only, a handful of months that where the temperatures pop up above zero. Most of the year is below, the temperatures are below zero and well below zero, getting down to minus 30, minus 40. Extreme temperatures can be minus 50. And we've just seen a week of that in the Yukon over the past week. Precipitation is pretty low. So at this particular site in Russia, we have 184 millimeters of rain. Most of that precipitation comes in the growing season, but again, most of the year, the precipitation is in the form of snow, so a large proportion of the total precipitation comes in the form of snow. Okay, yeah, we've gone through all of this. So tundra, the mean annual temperature is less than zero. So in this particular site, the mean annual average temperature is minus 14 degrees Celsius, okay? Conditions are moist, so precipitation, we've already talked about this, precipitation exceeds evapotranspirative fluxes. So you can see this variation in the type of tundra that we have. Here's a sort of a shrubby tundra site where there's lots of willows, and this is a much more kind of barren ground, open tundra area where there's very little in the way of vegetation. So the evapotranspirative fluxes depend on the type of vegetation you have, of course, but because the energy inputs at this high latitude are low, because the temperatures are very cool, because you have very limited vegetation, there's little in the way of water flux, and so even this low amount of precipitation exceeds the evapotranspirative fluxes. Okay. Yeah, so some key points: no period of moisture deficit on the tundra, very short growing season. The vegetation is tends all to be fairly low vegetation types: grasses, lichens, shrubs. Some of these shrubs can get to be quite tall and are, again, as I mentioned, are increasing in height and extent with climate warming, and forbs. So these are perennial plants that die back above ground and regrow. So they keep below ground structures, but they regrow each year. From below ground. So poor drainage, very soggy soils. There's very few places that you actually want to sit down on the tundra without getting your pants wet. Decomposition is very slow, and as a consequence, you accumulate, like you do in the boreal, you accumulate these nice peat soils. And so there's a huge amount of carbon stored in tundra ecosystems, just like there is in boreal ecosystems. And these are just some pictures. This is polygonal terrain, so all of these sort of lines in the landscape are ice wedges that are below the surface. So the soil, because of freeze-thaw processes, the soil cracks and opens up, and water, big wedges of ice form in these cracks. And so this is called polygonal terrain, and it's really quite beautiful to see from the air, and really fascinating thaw processes and different vegetation communities that occur in these troughs versus in the sort of upraised land. The hydrology in tundra ecosystems is really apparent as you fly across these tundra landscapes. You can just the waterways just are filled with different vegetation types than the more upland areas, and it's really the drainage channels in tundra ecosystems is so apparent because of the lack of taller vegetation. And there's lots of cryoturbation that happens. So frost heaving that actually is so dramatic that it kind of turns the soil over, and you end up with these little mini disturbances. It's really interesting to see what happens in those little disturbances where you have the types of vegetation that recruit on those. And so this is one of the things we see in tundra shrubbing, is that very often when you have these little patches of cryoturbated soil, that you'll have shrubs establishing on those little points of disturbance. Okay, so human influences, airborne pollutants. So lots of pollutants are carried to tundra and even higher Arctic areas, which, for an area that's considered sort of pristine and relatively where population densities are so low, there are so few people who live there. Despite that, there are some issues with pollution that cause problems in wildlife and in people. Oil and mineral exploration, extraction, and transport. This is a major issue in tundra environments. There's lots of there is historically and presently lots of extraction of oil and mineral resources, and the impact of those extractive activities on the environment, on the wildlife, can be quite substantial, and the legacy of those. So in tundra ecosystems, there's a huge number of legacy sites where extractive activities have occurred, but the remediation processes have not been carried out. And it was sort of assumed that the presence of permafrost would keep any of these contaminants intact, and increasingly with warming, we're seeing that permafrost is not doing the job that people hoped it would for the long term. So some real issues associated with those extractive industries. And then climate change, global warming, permafrost thaw, landslips, coastal erosion, tundra greening. Here's a couple of examples of sort of mass wasting processes. One being this big kind of active layer detachment slump here on the edge of this lake that used to be at the height of this tundra, but the permafrost thawed quickly underneath it, and we refer to that as thermokarst, abrupt thaw. And here we actually see a piece of the landscape. So this is all ice here under the surface. So massive ice, massive ground ice. And this piece has just carved off because of coastal erosion, which is increasing as we lose more sea ice and wave action is more intense. And then that coupled with warming and failure of permafrost integrity leads to these kinds of processes. So lots of impacts of humans even in this really sparsely populated part of the world. Now, I lied to you. This is our last one, mountains. These occur, of course, all over the world. So we have mountains all over, you know, in every continent and across several biomes. So the thing I want you to take home about mountains is that, you know, when we think about latitudinal gradients, so whether we're thinking about a latitudinal gradient from lowland like aseasonal tropical forest up to kind of savanna or grassland type systems as you're moving across that latitudinal gradient of precipitation, or whether you're talking about a latitudinal gradient from, you know, temperate to Arctic or boreal to tundra. These kinds of latitudinal gradients play out over much shorter time, shorter spatial scales, moving up mountains because of that lapse rate we talked about in the last class. So as you move up in elevation, we have decreases in temperature as we move up in elevation because of that lapse rate. And so you'll see these bands of vegetation that correspond with the kinds of gradients that we see across very large latitudinal gradients from, you know, deciduous forest, transitioning into conifer forest, transitioning into tundra, transitioning into bare ground that you see in very, very high Arctic locations. So this is like a compressed version of the latitudinal gradient in the northern hemisphere, like in Canada, for example. So these gradients in altitude can parallel gradients in latitude. The direction of the exposure is really important. Whether you're north facing, south facing, this dictates the type of vegetation and the kinds of transitions you're going to see moving up that mountain face. And you can have very different vegetation communities on one side of the mountain and the other. And so this is just an example of this as our last slide of the presentation. Moving up in elevation, you go from this lower montane zone with these open kind of dry regions to this montane zone where you have maybe more trees occurring, up into the subalpine zone. Different, you know, you can see the tree species have shifted to these subalpine fir trees here, and more open area right up to this alpine zone where you have tundra vegetation. So we have this gradient moving up this elevational, this vegetation gradient moving up this elevational gradient. So that's all I have to say today. I know this is a bit of a long lecture, a long walk through these biomes, but hopefully you have a sense of what these biomes are, where they are, what their climates look like, the type of vegetation, and some of the pressures that they're experiencing. And that will put us in a good place to talk about some of the other topics throughout the course. Okay, and with that, I will say goodbye. I'll see you tomorrow in our in-person synchronous lecture. Yeah, and I'll talk to you soon.